how does the quality of your third grade teacher affect how much you're earning when you're 30 years old? Now, in order to answer that question, the first thing we need to do is define a measure of the quality of teachers, right? If I want to show you that higher quality teachers have an impact, I have to have some concrete way of measuring the quality of teachers. The measure we focus on is one that's very topical in the US, very relevant to the current policy debate. It's what are called value-added measures of teacher quality. So there's some complicated statistics in the background, but the basic concept of these value-added measures is extremely simple. Essentially, we ask how much a teacher raises his or her students' test scores on average to calculate that teacher's value added. So for example, if I am a fourth grade teacher, we would calculate my value added by looking at my students' test scores at the end of fourth grade on average, minus their test scores, say, at the end of third grade on average. And if that number is very positive, then we'd say I'm a high value added teacher. And if that number is very negative, we'd say I'm a low value added teacher. Now, these value added measures are very widely discussed in the US at the moment because a number of school districts are starting to use these sorts of quantitative measures to evaluate the performance of teachers and select which teachers to keep and which teachers to recruit and so forth. And so understanding their properties is of direct policy interest. So what we want to do is basically ask, what is the effect of being assigned to a high versus low value added teacher on a child's long-term outcomes? Now, when trying to answer a question like this, it's often useful to step back and ask, what is the ideal experiment you would run from a scientific perspective in order to answer that question before turning to the empirical analysis? And so in this context, the experiment you'd like to run is take a set of teachers and estimate their value added based on their students' prior historical data, right? So say a teacher is taught for 5 years, we can use earlier data to classify all the teachers as high versus low value added. And then we'd take a new batch of kids and we'd tell their parents, look, we want to answer this really important policy question of whether teacher value added matters for kids' long-term outcomes. So we're going to run an experiment with your kids where we'll randomly assign some of your children to teachers we've identified as being high value added and some as being low value added. And let's see how your kids do 25 years from now. So as you can imagine, running that experiment is not very easy in practice. And so the power of having these huge data sets, where Sweden, I think, is really a pioneer in leading this sort of thing, is that we can essentially approximate this experiment with the data we already have. And so to illustrate that, this, what I'll call a quasi-experimental methodology, we're going to exploit the fact that there's a lot of turnover in schools, lots of teachers coming in and going out, which effectively creates something analogous to the experiment I just described. So to show you that concretely, let's say we're tracking a given school over time, and we're going to look at fourth graders who enter the school in different years. So fourth graders in 1993, 1994, 1995, and so forth, different cohorts of kids. And so let's look at the evolution of fourth grade test scores over time in this school. And we see that, test scores are kind of bouncing around the median, okay? This is based on averaging thousands of such data points in this huge data set I was describing. And what happens at the end of the 1995 school year is that a new teacher comes in who, based on prior data, we've identified as being in the top 5% of the distribution in terms of her value added. So a very highly effective teacher based on this value added metric. And so let's look at what happens to test scores when that high value added teacher comes in. You can see that test scores immediately jump up and continue to stay high as that teacher continues to teach subsequent cohorts of children. Okay, so that suggests that having a high value added teacher has a causal impact on children's test score performance. Now, we all know that in any experiment like this, you want to have a treatment group, which is analogous to what I just showed you here, but you also want to have a control group to make sure that nothing else changed at the same time that might have contaminated this analysis. And in this context, there's a very natural control group, which is to look at third graders, because the idea is that the better teacher came in fourth grade. She should have improved fourth grade test scores, but should have had no effect on third grade test scores, right? Because those were measured before those students were taught by this teacher. And in fact, when we plot test scores in third grade, you see that they don't change at all when that better teacher comes in, which lends credence to the hypothesis, to the claim that this really captures the causal effect of the teacher. So you can see we're essentially able to approximate the experiment I was describing by exploiting the fact that lots of teachers come in and go out like this. And so here you see that an excellent teacher immediately raises her students' test scores. This works symmetrically in the other direction as well, right? So if you get this teacher who's in the bottom 5% of the distribution and doesn't want to be there, he immediately pulls down test scores in fourth grade relative to third grade. So it's completely symmetric across the distribution. So this here, I've been showing you that teachers really affect how well their students do on tests. But now to tie it back to where we started, thinking about children's long-term outcomes, we repeat exactly this type of analysis using children's earnings or college attendance rates or other outcomes instead of test score measures, right? And just to summarize in a simple way what we get from that analysis, let me use this hypothetical policy exercise here. So let's say we take the bell curve of teacher quality as measured by value added and consider a simple policy change, which is something that is being widely discussed and implemented in the US. Let's say we identify the teachers who are in the bottom 5% of the distribution based on their estimated value added. And suppose we either implement a training program or hire new teachers to bring the quality of these teachers up to the average, okay? So that's in principle a feasible policy intervention if we hire new teachers to replace the teachers who were in the bottom 5%. So what are the effects of such a change? We estimate, based on exactly the type of analysis that I was showing you, that simple change, having a teacher of average quality instead of the bottom 5% for a single year, would increase the lifetime earnings of the average child in the US by an undiscounted sum of $50,000, which for a classroom of average size in the US, which has about 28 students, would be worth $1.4 million per classroom. Or if you discount that back to present value and view this as an investment, discounted at 5% interest rate, it's worth about $250,000 when kids are 10 years old per classroom. So relative to the typical salaries of teachers, the value of having highly effective teachers relative to less effective teachers is incredibly large. And more generally, this underscores the fact that trying to improve the quality of teachers and schools more broadly can be a very powerful way of increasing rates of upward mobility.